Okay, now we're recording on 3 different streaming services, so I hope Jane is ready for her close-up. I've spoken to a lot of you about different moments when I knew I was in the right congregation for me, and one of them was when I learned that one of our congregants had written a book called The Introvert's Complete Career Guide from Landing a Job to Surviving, Thriving, and Moving on Up. I felt I am a person who I always joke that I was born introverted and was raised extroverted, and or that I am an introvert in an extroverted profession, which actually a lot of rabbis are. You don't necessarily always know that because we talk a lot. So it's really wonderful to know that there is research being done, that there's focus being put on people who maybe aren't exhibiting in some of the traditional ways of being outgoing and extroverted. So I'm excited to hear from Jane this evening. Jane has served as the Associate Director of Career Services at the University of Pennsylvania, where she created and led the Wharton Career Discovery Seminar and served as liaison to recruiters for major corporations. She's been published in many major publications, including Business Insider, Huffington Post, and Psychology Today. And she has been the career advisor for U.S. News and World Report's Education and Career Forum, and a delegate for National Career Development Association People-to-People Ambassador Program in China. And we are really excited to hear her for a TAG talk this evening. We are rebranding as a TED is, I think, copyrighted. TAG stands for Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim, learning, service, and acts of loving kindness. So welcome to Jane Finkle.
Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Shabbat Shalom. And I'm really pleased to be invited tonight to talk about one of my favorite topics, introversion. And I just want to let extroverts know that you're going to be included too, because you really can't talk about introversion without talking about extroversion. So before I sort of dive into sort of the meat of my presentation, I know many of you may have taken the Myers-Briggs, but some people may not really understand the difference between extroversion and introversion. So I just want to briefly highlight the difference. So extroversion and introversion is a product of Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychiatrist and a disciple of Freud. And this was, introversion and extroversion was part of his personality theory. And a lot of people, when we think about extroversion and introversion, extroverts are social butterflies and introverts are wallflowers. But according to Jung, introversion and extroversion is about our energy. So extroverts tend to be more energized when there's lots of opportunity to connect to the external world, people and activity. Doesn't mean they don't like to be alone, but their energy tends to expand in the connection to the external world. Introverts like people and they like activity, but they need more time to be alone because they get a lot of energy from reflection, quiet, calm, and thinking about things very carefully. So there's a spectrum. You know, nobody's maybe totally introverted or totally extroverted. And your extroversion and introversion can be enhanced or impeded by our experience. So it's not necessarily static. But I do think, as Carl Jung said, that it's probably inborn. So I can use my own experience. My mother described my brother and I, my brother who was like a super extrovert, never stopped talking, that when we were growing up, he was constantly engaging her in conversation. And she would have me in another room. I'd be reading a book, I'd be doing a puzzle, and she would describe me as quiet and well-behaved. So it's just important to understand the difference between introversion and extroversion. When we talk about extroversion, and especially introversion, I should say, there's lots of misconceptions. In fact, they did a survey and they asked extroverts, did they think that introverts were shy? And 81% said yes. When they asked introverts if they would call themselves shy, only 40%. So that kind of reinforces that there's a lot of disconnect in how we view introverts and how we view extroverts. So I call it the poor introvert syndrome, because after I wrote the book, I had an opportunity to be on radio shows and podcasts. And I can't tell you how many times a host would say to me, oh, I know, my friend's an introvert. She can barely go to a social event. So, or something about, you must have had a really difficult time being an introvert, writing a book and now talking on a podcast. So that's why I came up with the poor introvert syndrome, because it's just not true that introverts don't have good social skills. And as a matter of fact, they have lots of really good qualities. So some of them are that they're keen observers, they listen really well, they tend to be a little reserved and modest, they tend to go for depth, and they tend to be a little bit more sensitive than extroverts, because I think that they've had the experience of feeling a little bit left out. On the other hand, extroverts kind of easily engage in conversation, really good at small talk, love to bop around a room and talk to a lot of people. They tend to be a little bit more spontaneous. And they go, in a social situation, they go for breath. They like to just bounce around and talk to a lot of people. Where introverts will certainly go around and talk with a lot of different people, but they will find it much more rewarding if they can have an in-depth conversation with one or two people. So recently I went to a wedding, and it started at 5 o'clock, and I thought, this is great, I'll be home maybe by 10. It wasn't that I didn't want to go to the wedding. I just knew at a certain point my energy would be depleted. So of course that didn't happen. I didn't get home till 11:30. But what I remember about that night is that I saw a cousin of mine, a very close cousin I hadn't seen in a long time, and we spent like 45 minutes at the wedding having this really in-depth conversation. And that was so satisfying to me. So that's kind of the difference. I do think that one of the hallmark differences between extroversion and introversion is that when there's a problem or an issue, extroverts just start talking. They pick up the phone, they go into somebody's office, they actually solve their problems by talking things through out loud. Where introverts are likely not to say anything right away, maybe go off on their own, kind of think about it for a while, and maybe they figure it out on their own, or maybe they call someone that they trust after they've had time to process and think about it. And I think sometimes this is the most difficult, or this is the tension sometimes between extroverts and introverts, because extroverts would like you to respond right away, and introverts want a little time and space to think things through. So why I think sometimes we think of the poor introvert is that the American culture leans towards extroversion. You're rewarded for speaking up and taking action. On the other hand, there are other cultures in the world that veer towards introversion. So there are many Asian countries and some countries in Africa. But we're in America, and we have to deal with the fact that the American culture does lean towards extroversion. So in fact, when they did a survey of a group of introverts in a work situation, and they were asked about whether they thought that they would get promoted when compared with extroverts. And 4 out of 5 of them said that they expected extroverts to be promoted before them. So there is some kind of a sense as an introvert that you may be at a disadvantage. I think that in terms of the disadvantage, the American culture, you're rewarded for speaking up and taking action, and not so much for kind of reflection and thinking about things really carefully. So on top of that, there is science out there. And they found that when they looked at the brains of extroverts and introverts, that extroverts release more dopamine because dopamine is connected to external rewards. And introverts release more what they call acetylcholine, which is for inner rewards. Now, we all release both of that, but there is that interesting balance. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is they took a look at brains of introverts and extroverts, and they discovered that introverts have more gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, which is the center for abstract thinking and decision making. So I don't know if it necessarily means they're better at it. It just means that there's a lot of energy and activity that goes on for introverts in that space in the brain. So as I mentioned before, the challenge of introversion. I had a personal experience when I was at the University of Pennsylvania. I just graduated from, got my graduate degree in counseling psychology, and I got this great job at the University of Pennsylvania. I was very excited, but I had never worked in an office. Had never worked in an office with so many people. It was a large office, and every Friday there was a big staff meeting, and it was expected for you to say something, and I totally froze. I just didn't know. I just didn't know how to just jump in and say anything, and I thought that I was failing. I thought after my evaluation they might ask me to leave. What happened is I got an opportunity to move to another area of the office, and I was told I would have to interview for it. And I said, well, that's fine. And the next day, the director came to me and she said, your new boss doesn't need to interview you, she thinks you're great. And she highlighted qualities that were more introverted. So what I realized is that there was something good about being introverted, but that didn't solve my problem. So I had to figure out how to manage these staff meetings. But it was sort of a symbol for how I was going to need to manage my life and career in the future. So I was very fortunate because my new boss was a mentor and she was also a rabbi. So it was like a double gift. And basically, she would say to me, at the staff meeting, you should talk about this project that you're working on. And so I would make notes and I would go to the staff meeting. I probably stumbled a little bit, but then I was able to, present the information. It got easier each time. So it sounds like a simple thing, but it's something that really works for introverts, and it's called advanced planning. It's going to sound funny, I had to learn how to interrupt, because I think that introverts think it's very impolite. And so in my book, I call it diplomatic interruption, where maybe the meeting is ended and you haven't said anything, and you could say, I see that we only have 5 minutes left, and there's something very important in the project that I'm working on that I want to share with you. So they're all different techniques. So because I had this struggle, that's why I ended up writing the book, because I wanted to advocate for introverts, but most important, I wanted to help them advocate for themselves. So what happened as a result of learning to be more successful at work is that I integrated more extroverted skills. And that really is probably the most important thing that I can say to introverts, is that you can be who you are, but you're going to have to move a little bit beyond your comfort zone and integrate some extroverted skills. And the more I did it, the more I enjoyed it, but I didn't change. I still valued, at the end of the day, going to a quiet place and reading a book. So I don't think that that's changed much. So I think that introverts need to embrace it and learn. The other thing that introverts have to learn is how to promote themselves. So another thing that I observed at work for my colleagues going in and out of the office, to the director's office. And I thought, oh my God, that's so obnoxious. You know, they're kind of sucking up to her. But they were promoting themselves. So, you know, that's another thing, especially in this day and age when people want to know what your brand is. You know, we're products now. And, you know, people want to know like what you stand for. So you do have to know how to promote yourself. I will say that I think that some of the newer trends in the workplace and in the world are actually an asset to introverts. So, you know, they're talking about the hybrid workplace. I don't know how that's all going to unfold, but actually it's the perfect combination for both introverts and extroverts. A few days at home and a few days in the office. So I think it's a great plan. We'll see how it works. But the other thing is that technology and social media has also been a gift to introverts. You can think really carefully before you post anything. You can write a blog. You can send an email, but you've got time to think about it in advance. So whenever that's an opportunity, it works. It really works in favor of introversion. So I guess what I would say about introversion and extroversion is that it's like the yin and yang. And it isn't a matter of acceptance. It has more to do with understanding and appreciating. And, you know, we're living in this world of inclusion and accepting differences. And, it may not be as intense as gender and race, but it's still there. And it does impact introverts. So if you are extroverted and you're in a room with a group of introverts and you notice, maybe you don't even know that they're introverted, but you notice that somebody's quiet, it's not a bad idea to sort of invite them to participate. If they don't want to participate, they'll say so. But sometimes that kind of helps bring them in. And if you're introverted, you should appreciate that extroverts kind of initiate and get things going. And that can be really helpful if you're sitting back. So I think that it's really just about appreciating and understanding each other. And we're all trying to push towards balance. So, using both the introverted and extroverted side just really enriches our lives and our relationships. So.
Before you go anywhere, can you take a question or two?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
Does anyone have a question for Jane?
Yeah.
Are you an introvert or an extrovert?
Oh, I am. Yeah, I'm an introvert. Yeah.
Well,
I was describing that my childhood, and I should also mention that as I was growing up, I was more attracted to solitary activity. I certainly interacted with, had lots of friends, but I was a runner. I was editor of my school newspaper. I was in plays, and plays are good for introverts because you don't play yourself. You have to get into somebody's head. So.
Janine says, thank you, Jane, from one introvert to another. And it's funny because theater is always one of those things that throws people off because people assume that shyness and introversion are the same thing. And it's not, and I never thought of it that way, that it's, oh, I get to be somebody else. That's why I can, yeah.
Right.
Wonderful.
Yes.
All right, yeah, Linda.
Do you ever have to work with clients who are extroverted and you have to learn to them more about how to come down and be more introverted?
Well, mostly.
Can you repeat the question just for people online?
Okay. Mostly they're at an advantage. So, because, in a work environment, they're, usually promoting themselves really well. If they're a leader, then I think it becomes more of an issue, that they don't talk too much. So sometimes extroverts are talking and they need to make sure that they're listening. And sometimes they get easily distracted because they're very good at multitasking, picking up the phone, talking to someone. And so they have to be careful of that. But I think it is if you do lead groups, it is good to make sure that you give introverts some quiet time and also be sure that you listen. So.
Alan has a question, yeah.
Let's see, well, one thing I would say is that 7 years ago when I wasn't sure, where my career was gonna go, I talked to Jane and now I knew. And the funny thing is that a year ago, my son did the same thing, and now he's doing great. So anyway, 2 endorsements. But the
Yes.
question becomes, can a leader be introverted?
Oh, of course.
And how does an introverted leader, lead?
So here is there's 2 examples I'm going to give you, and I'm using 2 Democrats, and it's not it's not for political reasons, but sometimes when I've done the presentation, I talk about this. And I believe that Clinton, maybe he's a little bit in the shadow now, that he was very extroverted, loved to be center of attention. They interview him, he couldn't stop talking, sometimes with his foot in his mouth. But whether you liked him or not, he was in a leadership position. And I really think that Obama leaned towards introversion. When he had a cabinet meeting, he would not talk right away. He would have everyone go around in his cabinet and sort of, keep him up to date. And also sometimes people said he was in his head, would criticize him about that. But I think he definitely leaned towards introversion. So it's just a different style.
All right, well, I'm going to thank Jane so much, and I'm going to adjourn us to, there are some snacks and some drinks in the back. Thank you so much to Jane. Yashar koach, yeah. Yashar koach, which means may you go from strength to strength, and I just want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom.